I am Simone Carter, 34 years old, and for 11 years, I was the reason a $2 billion wealth management firm never lost a single client's money, never missed a single regulatory deadline, and never once had to explain itself to the Securities and Exchange Commission. Then the founder had a heart attack in the middle of a board meeting, and his only son walked into my glass-walled office 3 weeks later, sat down in my chair, and told me the firm no longer needed an operations person now that his girlfriend was ready to bring real vision to the business. She was 28. She had 1,100,000 followers. She had never read a prospectus in her life. When she smiled at me and said I should be grateful they were even offering me a severance package, I did not raise my voice. I did not cry. I simply picked up my bag, walked to the elevator, and let the doors close on the two of them standing in my office like they had already won something. They had no idea that in exactly 1 hour, every single client account at that firm would legally become frozen, untouchable, and completely unmanageable. Because my name, not the firm's, was the one registered with the federal government to trade a single dollar of it. Before I get into how it all fell apart for them, tell me in the comments where you're watching this from tonight. And if you've ever watched someone get treated like furniture right before they found out they owned the whole building, hit like and subscribe, because this one is for you. I grew up in a house where my mother said the same thing to me every single morning before school. Be so good they cannot ignore you, and be so careful they cannot replace you. She was a claims adjuster for 30 years at an insurance company that laid off half her department twice and kept her both times, because she made herself the only person who understood a filing system nobody else had bothered to learn. I watched her do that for 3 decades. I built my entire career on the same principle. I studied finance at Spelman, then got my MBA at Emory while working full-time as a junior analyst at a regional bank. I sat for my Series 7, then my Series 65, then my Series 24, collecting licenses the way other people collect vacation photos. Because I understood something early that most people in corporate America never fully absorb. Credentials are armor. Nobody can fire the only person legally allowed to do the job. I joined Sterling Wealth Partners when I was 23 years old, 3 years after Elliott Sterling founded it out of a rented office above a dry cleaner in Southwest Atlanta. Elliott was a self-made man, the son of a Pullman porter who had clawed his way through 2 decades at a predominantly white investment bank before deciding he was done making other men rich off the backs of black doctors, athletes, entertainers, and business owners who had nowhere sophisticated to put their money and nobody who looked like them to trust with it. He built Sterling Wealth Partners to be exactly that trusted place. By the time I came on board, he had 11 clients and $40 million under management. By the time I turned 34, we had over 400 clients and $2.1 billion under management, and I had personally built almost every system that kept it that way. I started as a junior analyst. I made Chief Compliance Officer by 28. I made Chief Operating Officer by 31. Elliott used to introduce me to new clients as the only person in this building smarter than me, and I built the building. I thought that meant something. I thought loyalty like that was permanent. 2 months before everything happened, Elliott suffered a massive heart attack in the middle of a Tuesday board meeting. He collapsed at the head of the table, and I was the one who caught him before his head hit the mahogany, the one who called 911 with a steady voice while 3 board members stood frozen, the one who rode in the ambulance because his wife was in Napa and could not get a flight back for 6 hours. He survived, but barely. The doctors put him on a 90-day medical leave with strict orders, no phone calls, no email, no stress, no business whatsoever. The moment word got out on Wall Street that Elliott Sterling was incapacitated, our custodian banks started asking uncomfortable questions. Two of our largest institutional partners threatened to pull their referral agreements. A financial reporter from a regional business journal started sniffing around, asking whether Sterling Wealth Partners could survive without its namesake at the helm. I did not sleep more than 4 hours a night for 6 straight weeks. I personally called every single one of our 400 clients, walked them through our continuity plan, and kept every single one of them from pulling their assets. I renegotiated our errors and omissions insurance policy after the underwriter tried to double our premium out of pure panic. I kept the firm's doors open, its licenses active, and its reputation completely intact through the worst crisis in its history. There was one board meeting in particular, about 5 weeks into Elliott's recovery, that I still think about whenever I need reminding of exactly how close the whole thing came to falling apart before Preston ever got involved. 3 of Sterling's 5 independent board members called an emergency session without consulting me first to discuss what one of them bluntly called an orderly wind-down plan. Essentially a polite phrase for liquidating the firm before the uncertainty around Elliott's health tanked its value any further. I was not technically required to attend that meeting, since I held no formal board seat, but I showed up anyway, uninvited, with a 60-page continuity presentation I had built over 3 consecutive sleepless nights. I stood in front of 5 board members who had built their entire careers on being risk-averse, and I walked them through every safeguard I had already put in place. The renewed insurance terms, the client retention numbers, the renegotiated lease terms on our office space, the emergency credit line I had personally secured using the firm's own receivables as collateral, rather than touching a single dollar of client assets. I told them, plainly, that liquidating a 30-year-old firm out of panic, 5 weeks into a temporary medical leave, would destroy more value in a single afternoon than the actual crisis itself ever could. One board member, an older gentleman named Harold Whitmore, who had known Elliott since business school, asked me directly whether I could personally guarantee the firm's stability if given full operational authority for the remainder of Elliott's recovery. I told him I could not guarantee outcomes, because nobody honest ever can. But I could guarantee that every decision I made would be built on the same rigorous, transparent process that had kept this firm compliant and trusted for a decade. The board voted, 4-1, to table the wind-down discussion entirely and grant me full interim operational authority instead. It was the single moment I am most proud of in my entire career. Quieter and far less dramatic than anything that happened months later with Preston, but in many ways, far more important, because it was the moment that actually saved the company before anyone needed a legal loophole to do it a second time. One of those calls in particular I will never forget. Our largest institutional referral partner, a regional bank whose private banking division had sent us nearly $60 million in referred assets over the years, called an emergency meeting 3 weeks into Elliott's medical leave, demanding to know whether Sterling Wealth Partners could guarantee operational continuity or whether they needed to begin quietly redirecting future referrals elsewhere. I flew to their headquarters in Charlotte on 4 hours' notice, walked into a boardroom of 9 executives who had never met me directly, only ever having dealt with Elliott personally, and spent 3 hours walking them through every safeguard, every compliance protocol, and every contingency plan I had built specifically for a moment like this one. The bank's chief risk officer, a sharp, skeptical woman named Deborah Ashford, stopped me halfway through my presentation and asked a question that I later realized was really a test. "If something happened to you tomorrow, the same way it happened to Elliott," she said, "would this firm survive that too?" I told her the truth. That I had spent 5 years quietly building redundancy into every system I managed, specifically because I had watched how fragile a firm built around one irreplaceable person could become, and that no single point of failure, including me, should ever again be allowed to threaten 400 families' financial security. She renewed the referral partnership that same afternoon and told me, on her way out of the boardroom, that she wished more firms she dealt with had someone like me quietly running the machinery behind the scenes. I did not know yet how prophetic that conversation would become. Deborah Ashford, as it turned out, remembered that meeting far more clearly than I expected. Almost a year later, once Carter Capital had established itself as a legitimate independent firm, she reached out directly. No longer representing the same bank, having moved into a senior role at a different institution, but calling specifically to say she wanted to begin referring select private banking clients to Carter Capital, citing the exact presentation I had given her during Sterling's darkest hour as the reason she trusted my judgment implicitly, regardless of which name happened to be on the door. That single relationship eventually became one of Carter Capital's most consistent sources of high net worth referrals, proof that the quiet, unglamorous work of building trust during a crisis nobody else was watching closely enough to notice pays dividends years after anyone remembers the specific afternoon it happened. While I was doing all of that, Elliot's son Preston was posting pictures of himself on a yacht in Mykonos. Preston Sterling was 33 years old, and he had never worked a single real day at the firm his father built. He held the title of Executive Vice President of Strategic Growth, a position Elliot had created for him 5 years earlier, mostly to give him something to put on a business card. Preston showed up to the office maybe twice a month, always late, always in a custom suit that cost more than a junior analyst's monthly salary, always talking about disruption and vision and the future of wealth management in a way that made it obvious he had never once sat through an actual client meeting. He believed, with the total unshakable confidence of a man who has never been told no by anyone who mattered, that the firm existed as a kind of family trust fund that happened to also manage other people's money. The moment his father was stable enough to be moved to a private rehabilitation facility, but still weeks away from being cleared for any decision-making, Preston flew back from Mykonos and walked into Sterling Wealth Partners like a prince returning to claim a throne nobody had actually offered him. He called an emergency meeting of the senior leadership team and announced, with zero board authorization and zero legal standing, that he was assuming the role of acting chief executive officer effective immediately. And he did not come alone. He brought Bianca Reyes with him. Everyone who followed her online knew her as Bree Lux, a 28-year-old lifestyle influencer with over 1 million followers, best known for sponsored posts about detox teas, waist trainers, and a short-lived skincare line that got dragged online for causing chemical burns. She had zero background in finance. She had never worked inside a regulated business in her life. But she had a beautiful face, a private jet aesthetic she had cultivated for 6 years, and an uncanny ability to convince Preston that she understood things he didn't, mostly because she agreed with everything he said. It happened on a Wednesday morning. I was in the middle of reviewing our quarterly Form ADV filing, the disclosure document every registered investment advisor has to submit to the SEC, when Preston's new assistant, a girl I had never seen before, hired without my knowledge or the HR director's, told me Preston needed me in the executive conference room immediately. The room had floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Atlanta skyline, the same windows I had stood in front of 100 times walking major clients through our 5-year growth strategy. I walked in carrying a folder of finalized custodian agreements, expecting to brief Preston on the emergency continuity protocols the board had asked me to prepare. Instead, I found him sitting in his father's chair at the head of the table, feet up on the polished surface, and Bianca perched on the edge of the desk beside him, scrolling her phone and occasionally glancing up like she was bored to be there. "Simone," Preston began, leaning back and lacing his fingers together with the kind of smug satisfaction that immediately put me on alert. "We're making some structural changes around here. This firm has been stuck in the past for way too long. We need someone who actually understands the modern client, someone with real reach, real influence, someone who can bring Sterling into a whole new tax bracket of visibility. I'm bringing Bianca on as Chief Growth Officer, and she's going to be handling client relations and brand strategy going forward." I stood there, holding the folder, genuinely searching his face for a hint that this was some kind of poorly timed joke. I looked at Bianca, who was now filing a chipped nail against the edge of the mahogany table without looking up. "You want her handling client relations," I said, keeping my voice level, "at a firm that manages retirement accounts, trust funds, and college savings plans for 400 families? This is a fiduciary business, Preston. Every single word she says to a client can be treated as investment advice under federal securities law. Does she even know what a fiduciary duty is?" Preston's jaw tightened, his ego visibly bruising at the pushback in front of his girlfriend. "You forget who's running this company now, Simone. I am the acting CEO. My father built this firm, and I am the one taking it into the future. Bianca has an eye for aesthetics and audience growth that this stale old firm desperately needs." "Aesthetics don't keep the SEC off our backs," I shot back, setting the folder down hard enough that it slapped against the glass table. The sound made Bianca flinch and clutch her designer bag like I had thrown a punch. "Do you know what's in this folder, Preston? This is the continuity filing I have spent 6 weeks putting together to keep this firm from being placed under heightened regulatory review while your father recovers. I have personally called every single one of our 400 clients to keep them from pulling $2 billion out of this business while you were posting yacht photos from Mykonos." Bianca let out a sharp, theatrical laugh that cut straight through the tension in the room. She slid off the desk and walked toward me, her heels clicking against the polished floor with the confidence of someone who had never once been told no in her life. "Don't be bitter just because you lack vision, Simone," she said, her voice honeyed and condescending. "You've done a fine job keeping the lights on, handling the boring paperwork, the filings, all of that. But it's time for a fresh perspective. I already have a whole content calendar planned, behind-the-scenes videos of client meetings, a rebrand of the whole firm identity, partnerships with luxury brands. You're just a hired hand, Simone. Preston needs a real partner to help elevate his family's legacy. You should know when it's time to step aside and let the real visionaries take over." A hired hand. I looked at this woman who had never sat through a single compliance audit, never once explained a required minimum distribution to a grieving widow, never spent a sleepless night making sure 400 families' retirement money was protected while the founder of the company lay in a hospital bed. And she was calling me a hired hand in the very room where I had personally kept her boyfriend's inheritance from collapsing 3 weeks earlier. My jaw tightened, but I refused to give either of them the satisfaction of watching me lose my composure. Preston stood up abruptly, jabbing a manicured finger in my direction. "That's enough, Simone. I will not have you disrespecting my partner in my building. Clear out your office today. You'll get a standard severance package, provided you sign an NDA and hand over your operational credentials to Bianca by end of day. I want your building badge, your laptop, and your login credentials on my desk by 5. For a fraction of a second, something like doubt flickered across Preston's face. A flash of the boy who used to watch me untangle his father's messes before he had any idea how complicated they were. Then it vanished, replaced by the same practiced arrogance he wore like his tailored suits. He laughed, shaking his head at Bianca, as if I had just told a pathetic, desperate joke. Can you believe this? She actually thinks this firm can't function without her for a single day. You are delusional, Simone. This isn't your company. You're not a founder. You're an employee who got a little too comfortable playing executive. I stood perfectly still. I did not cry. I did not beg. I did not try to explain the tangled architecture of federal securities law that I had spent 11 years mastering to keep his family out of a regulatory nightmare. When you're holding the detonator, you don't need to scream. Preston reached over and pressed the button on his desk intercom. Security, I need someone in the executive conference room. We have a terminated employee who needs an escort out of the building. He leaned forward, palms flat on the glass table, trying to project the kind of authority his father had commanded without even trying. On Preston, it looked like a child playing dress-up in his father's oversized suit. You can walk out on your own, or they can walk you out, he said. Either way, you're done here. Don't bother going to your office. We'll ship your personal items to you. Everything else belongs to the firm now. 2 security guards appeared at the glass doors within minutes. I knew both of them by name. I had personally approved their hiring, signed off on their holiday bonuses, and once stayed on the phone with one of their wives for 45 minutes, helping her understand an HSA reimbursement issue. They looked deeply uncomfortable, avoiding my eyes, shifting their weight like they wanted the floor to open up beneath them. I did not wait for them to reach for my arms. I turned and walked out on my own, spine straight, heels clicking a steady, unbothered rhythm against the marble floor. The executive floor at Sterling Wealth Partners was designed as an open-concept space, essentially a giant glass fishbowl of ambition. Word traveled fast in a firm built on high-stakes deadlines and tightly wound nerves, and by the time I stepped out of that conference room, the usual hum of ringing phones and clicking keyboards had gone completely silent. Portfolio managers, compliance analysts, client service associates, everyone had stopped to watch. They watched in stunned silence as the woman who had approved their parental leave, negotiated their bonuses, and personally kept the firm from collapsing 3 weeks earlier, was being escorted out like a corporate spy. I caught the eye of Desmond Reeves, our head of trading operations, a steady, sharp man who had been with the firm almost as long as I had. He was holding a stack of trade confirmations, his mouth slightly open. I gave him a single, subtle nod. He swallowed hard and looked back down at his monitors. He was smart enough to know something enormous was about to happen, even if he had no idea yet exactly what. Preston followed a few steps behind me in the security guards, making sure his little display of power was witnessed by every person on that floor. He was barking small, meaningless instructions at his assistant as he walked, playing the role of the decisive new boss making the hard calls to cut dead weight. He wanted me to look back. He wanted to see some flicker of panic, some crack in my composure, some proof that I understood I had just lost everything. I gave him nothing. I did not slow down. I did not speed up. I walked with the calm, unhurried certainty of a woman who knows exactly what happens in the next hour, while everyone around her is still congratulating themselves on the last 5 minutes. The elevator doors opened. I stepped inside and turned around. Preston stood in the lobby with his arms crossed, flanked by the 2 security guards, wearing a triumphant, condescending smirk, clearly convinced he had just won the single greatest victory of his adult life. The doors slid shut between us. I heard him laugh at something Bianca said just before the doors clicked closed completely. The elevator hummed as it dropped, floor by floor. I leaned against the cool steel wall and let out one long, steady breath. 11 years of my life had gone into building the systems, the relationships, and the licenses that kept Sterling Wealth Partners functioning as a real, legally compliant business instead of a family vanity project. I had sacrificed relationships, sleep, and my own health for a company they thought I was just borrowing a paycheck from. They thought I was walking away with nothing. What Preston did not understand, because he had never once bothered to read the actual regulatory architecture of the business he now claimed to run, was the arrangement Elliot and I had built 5 years earlier, in the aftermath of a crisis that almost destroyed the firm the first time. 5 years ago, Elliot made a string of reckless personal investments: a failed restaurant group, a real estate deal that collapsed during a downturn, a lawsuit from a former business partner, that put his personal finances in serious jeopardy. When it came time for Sterling Wealth Partners to renew its status as a registered investment advisor with the SEC, our compliance attorney flagged a serious problem. Elliot's personal financial distress, combined with an open civil judgment against him, created real regulatory risk. The SEC does not take kindly to firms where the principal owner is drowning in unresolved liabilities. If regulators dug too deep, they could suspend the firm's registration outright, freezing every single client account overnight. To save the company, I proposed something radical. I would form my own independent registered investment advisor, Carter Capital Management, LLC, under my name, with my flawless credit history and clean regulatory record. Sterling Wealth Partners would operate as a sub-advisor and solicitor under an exclusive agreement with my RIA. Every discretionary trading authorization, every custodial relationship, every single piece of paperwork that legally allowed anyone to move a client's money, all of it would be registered under my firm, not Sterling's. Elliot agreed immediately, mostly because he trusted me completely, and because it solved his problem overnight. He signed the agreement without a second thought. My name went on the FINRA registration. My signature authorized every discretionary trade that left that building. Sterling Wealth Partners, as a brand, was essentially a marketing name operating entirely inside the legal shell of my registered advisory firm. Preston did not just fire an employee that morning. By terminating my role without cause and having me physically removed from the premises, he triggered the automatic termination clause buried on page 41 of our sub-advisory agreement, the clause that voided Sterling's authorization to operate under my registration the moment my employment ended involuntarily. He had just handed me every legal ground I needed to shut down the firm's ability to touch a single dollar of client money. 30 minutes. That was the grace period written into the agreement before the termination became irreversible. A courtesy clause we had added years earlier in case of exactly this kind of dispute, giving both sides a short window to walk it back. I checked the time on my phone. He had already burned 5 of those 30 minutes trying to publicly humiliate me on the way to the elevator. I stepped out of the elevator into the sun-drenched lobby, pushed through the revolving doors, and walked into the thick, humid Atlanta air. I did not drive far. I pulled into the parking deck directly across the street and backed into a spot on the 4th level, giving me a clear, unobstructed view of Sterling's glass facade. I put the car in park, left the engine running, and pulled my laptop out of my bag. I connected to my mobile hotspot and logged into the secure FINRA and SEC compliance portal that controlled every registration tied to Carter Capital Management, LLC. 25 minutes left. I watched the countdown on my dashboard clock with total precision. At exactly the 30-minute mark, I opened the Sub-Advisory Management dashboard, selected the tab for active authorizations, and clicked Revoke, Termination without cause effective immediately. A security prompt appeared, asking me to confirm the suspension of Sterling Wealth Partners' operational authorization under my registration. I typed in my passcode and hit confirm without a single moment of hesitation. My screen updated instantly. The status indicator flipped from a calm, active green to a blaring, unmistakable red. Unauthorized. I looked up through my windshield at the glass building across the street. On the 14th floor where the trading desk sat, I watched a wave of movement ripple through the office. People standing up from their desks, phones lifting to ears all at once, heads turning toward the trading terminals in confusion. Somewhere up there, every single custodian platform Sterling Wealth Partners relied on to move client money had just locked them out completely. Every pending trade froze mid-execution. Every discretionary account went into a compliance hold. Every wire transfer request bounced back with an automated rejection code. $2,100,000,000, and not one of them could move a single cent of it without me. If you've ever watched karma move at exactly the speed of a federal compliance system, you already know it does not announce itself with fireworks. It announces itself with silence. The specific, suffocating silence of dozens of phones ringing at once and nobody having an answer. My phone buzzed within 4 minutes. It was Desmond Reeves, the head of trading. I let it ring twice before I picked up. "Simone, what is happening right now?" His voice was tight, controlled panic barely held together by 11 years of professional discipline. "Every account just locked. Custodian says our authorization's been pulled. Compliance is losing their minds. Preston's screaming in the hallway, please tell me you know something about this." "I do," I said calmly, watching a man I assumed was Preston pacing frantically in front of the 14th floor windows. "Sterling Wealth Partners has never been a registered investment advisor, Desmond. It never has been, not once, in 11 years. It's a marketing name for a business that operates entirely inside my registration. As of 9:42 this morning, Preston Sterling terminated my employment without cause, which automatically terminated the sub-advisory agreement between Sterling and Carter Capital Management. Sterling doesn't have legal authorization to trade a single share right now. I'd advise you not to touch a client account until you hear from me directly, because right now, anyone who executes a trade is doing so without any registered authority behind it, and that's a personal liability issue for whoever hits the button." There was a long pause on the other end. I could hear Desmond breathing, processing 11 years of assumptions collapsing in real time. "You're telling me," he said slowly, "that this entire firm has been running on your license this whole time, and nobody knew?" "Elliot knew," I said. "Elliot signed the agreement himself. Preston didn't bother reading it before he decided he wanted my badge on his desk by 5 o'clock. My phone buzzed again almost immediately with a second call. "Preston." I let it go to voicemail. It rang again. And again. On the 4th attempt, I answered, saying nothing, just letting the silence sit there so he would be the one forced to fill it. "Simone." His voice had lost every trace of the smug confidence from an hour earlier. It had the thin, cracking edge of a man realizing the ground underneath him had just disappeared. "What did you do?" "Every single account is frozen. Clients are calling. The custodian bank says we have no active authorization. Fix this. Fix this right now." "I didn't do anything except respond to the termination of my employment the way the contract requires," I said. "You fired me, Preston. You had security walk me out of a building I have never once been late to in 11 years. You told me everything belonged to the firm now. It doesn't. It never did. The firm belonged to a license I hold personally, and you just triggered the clause that ends the agreement. That's insane. That can't be legal. My father would never have agreed to something like that. Your father is the one who signed it, I said. 5 years ago, when his personal finances nearly took this firm down with him. You'd know that if you'd ever read a single document with your name on it, instead of just signing whatever your assistant put in front of you. I heard Bianca's voice in the background, sharp and rising, asking what was happening, why her phone was blowing up with messages from 3 different luxury brands asking whether their sponsored partnership announcement needed to be pulled. "Undo it," Preston said, his voice cracking into something almost pleading. "Whatever you did, undo it. I'll rehire you, right now, full title back. We'll forget this whole morning happened." I watched him through the glass, pacing in tight, desperate circles 14 floors above me. A man who 20 minutes earlier had told a room full of witnesses that the firm did not need me for half an hour. "You had 30 minutes to walk that decision back, Preston," I said. "You spent the first 5 of them making sure the whole office watched security escort me out. I'm not walking back into a building where I get called a hired hand in front of a woman who thinks a fiduciary duty is a type of skincare routine. Good luck with the SEC examiners. I imagine you'll be hearing from them shortly, since an unregistered entity currently holding $2 billion of client assets tends to get their attention fairly quickly." I hung up. I did not answer again. If you were the one directing this scene as a film, this is exactly where you'd let the camera hold steady on the glass building for a long, quiet moment. No music, no cuts. Just the sun glinting off $2 billion worth of panic behind floor-to-ceiling windows. I sat in that parking deck for another 20 minutes, watching people who had ignored me on my way out an hour earlier, now standing frozen at their desks, watching their entire professional world grind to a halt because the one person who actually understood how any of it worked was gone. By that afternoon, our largest custodian bank had issued a formal notice to all 400 Sterling clients, informing them that, due to a lapse in registered advisory authorization, all discretionary trading on their accounts had been suspended pending resolution. Panic does not spread through wealthy clients quietly. Within 2 hours, my personal cell phone, the number every single client had used to reach me directly for over a decade, started ringing nonstop. Athletes, executives, widows managing their late husbands' retirement accounts, small business owners who had trusted Sterling with their entire life's savings. All of them terrified. All of them asking the same question. "Simone, is my money safe? What is going on over there?" I answered every single one of them personally, the way I always had. I explained, calmly and honestly, that their assets remained completely secure. Nothing had been lost, nothing had been stolen. The freeze was simply a temporary regulatory hold triggered by a change in the firm's authorized advisory structure. I told them I could not discuss the specifics of an internal personnel matter, but that I would personally make sure their money was protected no matter what happened next. One of the calls that day came from a number I did not expect at all. Vanessa Sterling, Elliot's wife, calling from the rehabilitation facility where she had been staying nearby since his heart attack, having flown back from Napa the moment she heard what her son had done. Vanessa had never involved herself in the firm's operations in 30 years, content to leave the business entirely to Elliot and, more recently, to me. But her voice on the phone that afternoon was steady and clear in a way that told me she already understood far more than Preston probably realized. "I am not calling to ask about my accounts, Simone," she said. "I know my money is fine. I raised that boy, and I have watched him make excuses for his own choices his entire life, starting long before any of this happened at that company. I am calling to tell you that whatever you need to do to protect what Elliot spent 30 years building, You have my support. And you will have it regardless of what my son says or does in the meantime. Elliot cannot advocate for himself right now, so I am doing it for him. Protect this firm the way you always have. Do not let guilt over my son's feelings talk you out of doing what you know is right. I have thought about that phone call often in the years since, mostly because it was the first moment I fully understood that Preston's arrogance was not something Elliot's entire family shared, and that the people who actually mattered most in that story had already, quietly, chosen my judgment over his, long before the rest of the city figured out which side had been telling the truth. What I did not tell them yet, because the paperwork was not finalized, was that within 72 hours, I would be opening my own firm, and every single one of them would have somewhere safe to land. If you've ever watched someone try to rewrite reality because the truth was too embarrassing to admit out loud, you already know exactly what happened next. Comment below if you've seen this play before, because I promise you, it is always the same script. Since Preston could not tell the truth, that he had personally grounded a $2 billion firm by firing the only person legally authorized to run it, he needed a different story. A story that would make him the victim, instead of the architect of his own collapse. And in Atlanta's tight-knit circle of Black wealth, where 3 generations of doctors, judges, athletes, and business owners all sat on the same charity boards and attended the same galas, gossip moves faster than any wire transfer. By Friday, the story circulating through every group chat and every hair salon on the West Side was that I had been fired for embezzlement. The narrative Preston and Bianca constructed, piece by careful piece, claims I had been quietly siphoning client funds into a shell account for years, and that when Preston finally confronted me with proof, I had thrown myself at him in a desperate, humiliating attempt to keep my job, only to lash out and sabotage the firm's systems out of pure spite when he rejected me. It was a masterpiece of character assassination, engineered specifically to scandalize the people whose opinions mattered most in that world: the church mothers, the sorority sisters, the old money families who had known Elliot for 30 years and trusted his judgment implicitly. Preston played the role of the reluctant heir, bravely protecting his sick father's legacy from a greedy, unstable woman who could not handle rejection. And in that particular social circle, there is a deeply ingrained reflex to protect the wealthy, handsome son of a beloved community figure over the self-made woman who built everything behind the scenes. I found out exactly how far it had spread that Saturday night at the Magnolia Grove Society Gala, an annual black tie fundraiser for a pediatric cancer foundation that I had personally sat on the executive committee for 3 years. I had secured nearly a third of the corporate sponsorships in that room myself, including Sterling's entire annual contribution, which I had negotiated and finalized months earlier. I arrived wearing a deep emerald gown, my hair swept back, carrying myself with exactly the same composure I always had. The moment I stepped past the velvet ropes into the ballroom, the temperature in the room seemed to drop about 15 degrees. Crystal chandeliers cast a golden light over round tables draped in white linen. A live band played something slow and elegant in the corner, and every single conversation within 20 feet of me seemed to falter and go quiet the moment I walked past. Women who had hugged me and asked for discounted portfolio reviews the month before suddenly found their champagne flutes deeply fascinating. Men who had praised my financial instincts at last year's gala now turned their shoulders slightly, forming small physical walls that made it clear I was not welcome in their circle tonight. Whispers trailed behind me like smoke. I found out later, through Priya, who still had a handful of friends inside Sterling's marketing department, exactly how deliberately the smear campaign had been constructed. Preston had reportedly spent an entire Thursday afternoon on the phone with a public relations consultant, a woman he had hired specifically to help manage the narrative around his sudden takeover, workshopping different versions of the embezzlement story until they landed on one specific enough to sound credible, but vague enough to avoid any legal exposure for outright defamation. The consultant, according to Priya's source, had actually advised against it, warning Preston that fabricated character attacks tend to unravel quickly once the underlying facts become public. Preston reportedly overruled her, insisting that people believe the first story they hear, a philosophy that would end up costing him considerably more than he ever anticipated. That same public relations consultant, ironically, quietly reached out to me almost a year later, once Preston's federal case had become public knowledge, offering her services to help reintroduce Carter Capital's story to the wider Atlanta business community now that the truth had fully come out. I declined politely. I did not need anyone to reintroduce a story that 400 former clients, a federal judge, and an entire city's worth of gossip had already told far more effectively and far more honestly than any paid consultant ever could. I made my way toward Table 1, the executive committee's VIP table, where I had reserved and personally paid for 2 of the 8 seats. Sitting in my usual chair was Bianca, wearing a diamond necklace I recognized immediately because I had approved the corporate card statement that paid for it 3 weeks earlier. She was laughing loudly with the wife of a city councilman, and Preston sat beside her, arm draped possessively over the back of her chair, looking entirely too pleased with himself for a man whose firm currently could not process a single client withdrawal. Before I reached the table, Regina Hollis stepped directly into my path. Regina was the gala's chairwoman, a formidable, deeply connected society matron who had known both my mother and Elliot for over 20 years, and who considered herself the ultimate gatekeeper of respectability in that room. She wore a tight, uncomfortable smile that did not reach her eyes. "Simone, sweetheart," she said, in the specific tone of Southern politeness that somehow manages to cut deeper than an outright insult. She placed a heavily ringed hand on my forearm and attempted to steer me gently toward the exit corridor. "We have a bit of a seating situation tonight, I'm afraid." I stopped walking and she was forced to drop her hand. "There's no seating issue, Regina. My name is on the sponsor list. I paid for seat 3 at table 1 personally, out of my own account, back in March." Regina sighed, abandoning the polite performance for something closer to pity. "Simone, please don't make this difficult. The board had an emergency call this week. Given the, unfortunate allegations surrounding your departure from Sterling, we feel it's best if you step back from your role on the committee for now. We simply cannot have this kind of controversy attached to the foundation's name. Preston has been very generous. He's offered to double Sterling's usual contribution this year to make up for any confusion. It would be easier for everyone if you left quietly." The audacity of it was staggering. Regina had known me for over a decade. She had watched me build a career from nothing. Watched me personally deliver checks to this foundation year after year, watched me sit through 6-hour board meetings about hospital wing funding. And she believed, instantly and completely, the fabricated story of a man who had never once shown up to a single committee meeting, simply because he offered to write a bigger check. I looked past her shoulder. Preston was watching the entire exchange with a slow, satisfied grin spreading across his face. He caught my eye and lifted his champagne glass in a small, mocking toast. Bianca leaned into him, whispering something that made them both laugh. He genuinely believed that by stripping away my social standing in front of people whose respect I had spent years earning, he could break something in me. He thought public humiliation would send me into hiding. He had absolutely no idea what he had actually done. I turned my attention back to Regina, my expression calm, composed, and completely unreadable. "Regina," I said, my voice smooth and pitched just loud enough to carry to the surrounding tables. "You're absolutely right that the integrity of this foundation matters more than anything else. I'd hate for my name to be associated with an organization that values a bounce check over basic loyalty." Her brow furrowed. "A bounce check?" I smiled, sharp and entirely genuine. "I'd cash Preston's generous donation by Monday morning if I were you, Regina. Because by Tuesday, Sterling Wealth Partners will not have enough liquid operating capital to cover its own payroll, let alone a charitable pledge. Every single account at that firm has been frozen since Wednesday morning. If you'd rather keep the company of a man currently bleeding his father's business dry over the woman who actually kept it alive for the last 2 months, he's all yours." I did not wait for a response. I turned and walked through the ballroom with my head high and my shoulders back, feeling every stare on my back without letting a single one of them land. They no longer felt like judgment. They felt like static, noise from people who would understand exactly what had happened the moment their own advisors called them Monday morning asking whether their money was still with Sterling. Preston and Bianca got to keep their seats at the VIP table that night. They got to bask in the temporary, fragile approval of a room full of people who only respected them for a wealth that was already quietly disintegrating 3 floors above the room where I had once run my morning briefings. I stepped out into the cool night air, handed my ticket to the valet, and let myself smile for the first time all evening. Not everyone in that ballroom chose Preston's version of the story, and I think it's important I tell you about the ones who didn't. Because it would be easy to walk away from this thinking the entire community turned its back on me at once. It didn't. It just felt that way in the moment. The way a handful of loud voices always manage to feel louder than the quieter people still watching carefully from the sidelines. Judge Everett Halloway, a retired appellate judge who had been one of Sterling's very first clients back when Elliot was still operating out of that rented office above the dry cleaner, found me near the coat check as I was leaving. He was in his late 70s, sharp as anyone half his age, and he had absolutely no patience for gossip dressed up as concern. "I've had my money with that firm for 26 years, he said, without any preamble. 26 years, and the only person who's ever actually called me personally to explain a market downturn instead of hiding behind a quarterly statement was you. I don't know what happened over there this week, and frankly, I don't much care what these people are whispering about it. I know character when I've watched it up close for a quarter century. Whatever you're building next, you call me first." He was the first client, outside of the 400 formal accounts already at Sterling, to personally commit assets to Carter Capital before the firm even had a name registered with the state. His decision, quiet and unbothered by the gossip swirling around him, gave me something I badly needed in that exact moment, which was proof that the people whose judgment I actually respected were not the ones lining up to believe a fabricated story simply because it was more entertaining than the truth. Let them enjoy the champagne and the string quartet. I already had a meeting scheduled for Monday morning with an attorney to file the paperwork for my new firm. If you were watching the movie version of my life, the Monday after that gala would open on a split screen. On one side, the offices of Sterling Wealth Partners, dark hallways, unanswered phones, a compliance team frantically drafting client notifications nobody had approved them to send. On the other side, a small furnished office suite I had signed a 6-month lease on that Sunday afternoon, with a single whiteboard, 3 folding chairs, and a nameplate that simply read, Carter Capital Management. I did not sleep much that weekend either, but this time the exhaustion felt different. It felt like building instead of surviving. I called my attorney first thing Sunday morning, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Patrice Okafor, who had handled Sterling's regulatory filings for years and knew exactly how the sub-advisory agreement was structured, because she was the one who had drafted it. Within hours, she confirmed what I already suspected. Because Carter Capital Management had always held the actual registered investment advisor status, and Sterling had only ever operated as a solicitor under my authorization, there was no legal barrier stopping me from continuing to operate my own firm independently. I did not need to build a new business from scratch. I needed to formally announce that the business had, in the eyes of the federal government, never actually belonged to Sterling in the first place. By Monday morning, I had drafted a short, carefully worded letter to all 400 Sterling clients. I did not mention Preston by name. I did not mention the gala, the rumors, or the embezzlement lie circulating through half of Atlanta's social circles. I simply explained, in plain, professional language, that Carter Capital Management, LLC, the SEC-registered advisory firm that had always held legal authority over their assets, was continuing operations independently, effective immediately, and that their accounts would be fully restored to active trading status within 48 hours under my direct oversight, at no interruption to their existing fee structure. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within 6 hours, over half of Sterling's 400 clients had signed and returned the transfer authorization form. By Wednesday, it was closer to 80%. People who had built relationships with me personally over a decade, who trusted my judgment through market crashes, through inheritance disputes, through their own family emergencies, did not need convincing. They needed a phone number, and I had made sure they already had it. Desmond Reeves called me Tuesday morning. He did not ask for a favor, he simply said, "I've put in my 2 weeks. Tell me where to send my resume." I hired him by Friday, along with 3 of Sterling's most senior portfolio managers and 2 compliance analysts who had quietly reached out asking whether Carter Capital had room for people who actually wanted to keep their licenses clean. Within 3 weeks, my 3 folding chair office suite had become a real operation with 14 employees, a proper trading floor, and a lease on a full office space 2 buildings down from Sterling's headquarters, close enough that Preston could see the new Carter Capital signage from his own conference room window, if he wanted to. Not every client transfer went smoothly, and I think it's worth telling you about the one that nearly broke my composure that week, because it reminds me the whole ordeal was never purely triumphant, even in its most successful moments. An elderly widow named Ms. Odessa Grant, one of Sterling's original clients from the earliest days above the dry cleaner, called me in tears, terrified that some kind of bank trouble meant her late husband's pension savings, the only money she had left in the world, had simply vanished. She did not understand words like registration or authorization or custodian freeze. She only understood that her monthly distribution, the one that covered her mortgage and her medication, had not shown up in her account that week. I drove to her house in East Point myself that same afternoon, sat at her kitchen table exactly the way I once sat at Carl Whitfield's, and walked her through everything in plain language. No jargon, no acronyms, just the honest truth that her money was completely safe, and that I would personally make sure her distribution arrived within days, regardless of what happened with the paperwork. I paid her missed distribution out of my own pocket that week, quietly, without telling anyone at the firm, simply because an 81-year-old widow should never have to wonder whether her mortgage payment depends on a corporate power struggle she had absolutely nothing to do with. She was fully reimbursed once Carter Capital's systems were live, and she has been one of my most loyal clients ever since, still calling me every Christmas just to check in, long after her accounts have needed anything more complicated than a routine annual review. Sterling Wealth Partners, meanwhile, was collapsing in exactly the way you'd expect a firm to collapse once its only source of legal authorization walked out the door and took 80% of its client base with her. With client assets under management cut by more than 3/4 almost overnight, the firm's revenue model imploded. Preston, desperate to slow the bleeding, made the single worst decision of his entire life. He told Bianca to use her platform to bring in new business. Bianca had spent 5 years building an audience around a very specific promise: luxury without effort, wealth without work, results without proof. She applied that exact same formula to finance. She began posting videos, glossy and confident, promising her followers access to an exclusive high-yield wealth strategy through Sterling Wealth Partners, complete with screenshots of returns that, according to the actual account statements I still had backup access to as the firm's former chief compliance officer, simply did not exist. She quoted annualized returns nearly triple what any of Sterling's actual managed portfolios had ever produced. She told her followers on camera that regular people could get in with a minimum investment of just $5,000, funneled through a private client concierge program that had never been reviewed, registered, or disclosed to a single regulator. It was, in the most literal legal sense, securities fraud. Specifically, it was what the SEC calls touting, promoting an investment using false or unsubstantiated performance claims without proper disclosure in exchange for compensation. And because Bianca had over 1 million followers and had been doing it publicly, on video, with her face and Sterling's actual logo stamped in the corner of every post, it was about as easy a case to build as a federal regulator could ever hope for. I did not have to report it. Someone else beat me to it. A financial journalist who had been quietly investigating Sterling's sudden client exodus for a business publication stumbled onto Bianca's videos while researching the story and flagged them directly to the SEC's Enforcement Division. Within 2 weeks, Sterling Wealth Partners received a formal request for documents and testimony. Within a month, the SEC had opened a full investigation into Preston Sterling personally as the firm's acting chief executive for failure to supervise, along with a separate inquiry into Bianca Reyes for unregistered investment promotion and fraudulent performance claims. If you've made it this far, drop a comment telling me what you think happens next, because I promise you, even I did not see how fast the rest of it would fall apart. By late that summer, Preston's world had narrowed down to a series of increasingly desperate phone calls. His trust distributions, which had always been tied to Sterling's operating revenue, had dried up entirely, since the firm was now hemorrhaging money just trying to cover its own legal fees. His personal credit cards, several of which had been quietly linked to Sterling's corporate account for business expenses that were really just his lifestyle, got flagged and frozen once the firm's forensic accountants started digging through the books as part of the SEC's document request. The lease on his downtown penthouse lapsed. The lease on his Range Rover lapsed. The story that had once painted him as the noble son protecting his father's legacy had flipped entirely. And Atlanta's gossip machine, the same one that had shredded my reputation 2 months earlier, pivoted with breathtaking speed to feast on his instead. He started calling me, not screaming, not threatening, pleading. I let most of the calls go to voicemail, but I listened to every single one of them, because there is a particular kind of satisfaction in hearing a man who once told you that you were just a hired hand ask, in a small, cracking voice, whether you might consider consulting for the firm again, just temporarily, just until things settled down. I finally agreed to see him in person, mostly because Patrice advised me it would look better for Carter Capital's public image to appear reasonable and unbothered rather than vindictive. And mostly because I wanted to see, up close, exactly how far the man who had once had security drag me out of a building had fallen. He showed up at my office on a Thursday afternoon without an appointment, wearing a suit that no longer fit him quite right, like he had lost weight he could not afford to lose. He sat across from me in the small conference room at Carter Capital, the one with the exposed brick wall and the framed photo of my mother that I had hung up my first week in the new space, and he did not bother with pleasantries. "I need you to talk to the SEC," he said. "Tell them I didn't know what Bianca was posting. Tell them I never approved any of it. You know how this works, Simone. You know the language they respond to. One phone call from you, one statement about my lack of direct involvement, and this whole thing gets a lot smaller for me." "You were the acting CEO," I said. "Failure to supervise doesn't require you to have known what she was posting. It requires you to have had the responsibility to know and to have failed at it. That's not a language problem, Preston. That's the actual statute." His hands were shaking slightly around the coffee cup he had not touched. "My father's lawyers say I could lose everything. Not just the firm. Everything. My inheritance, my house, all of it. Simone, please. I know what I said to you. I know what I did. I was wrong. I'm asking you, one professional to another, to help me." I studied him for a long moment. There was no version of this conversation where I owed him anything, and we both knew it. But there was something almost pitiable in watching a man realize months too late that the woman he had dismissed as a hired hand was the only person who had ever actually protected him from himself. "I can't undo federal charges, Preston," I said, not unkindly, but not warmly either. "I'm not going to lie to a federal regulator for you. But I'll tell you something I don't think anyone around you has bothered to say yet. Get your own lawyer, separate from the firm's counsel, because right now, Sterling's attorneys are protecting the firm, not you personally, and those interests are about to diverge very badly." He left without saying goodbye, and I did not expect to hear from him again for a while. What I did not expect was the phone call I got 2 weeks later at almost 11 at night from a number I did not recognize. It was Bianca. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. "I need to tell you something," she said, her voice stripped of every ounce of the breezy influencer confidence I remembered from that boardroom months earlier. "And I need you to actually listen, because I think you're the only person who's going to believe me." She told me she had recorded almost every conversation she and Preston had over the past 4 months. Initially just out of habit, the way she recorded everything for content, but increasingly on purpose once she realized he was steering her into legal danger without telling her the risk. She had audio of him instructing her, explicitly, to inflate the performance numbers in her videos because people believe whatever number looks impressive. She had a recording of him admitting, in a panicked late-night call after the SEC subpoena arrived, that he had personally forged my signature on 2 internal compliance memos months after I left, backdating them to make it look like Sterling had proper supervisory documentation in place before the investigation started. A separate and significantly more serious offense than anything either of them had been under investigation for so far. "I'm not doing this because I feel bad," she said flatly. "I'm doing this because my lawyer told me that cooperating early gets me a much better deal than waiting until they subpoena my phone anyway. And they will subpoena my phone. I'd rather hand it over than have it taken from me. But I wanted you to hear it from me first, because you're the one he threw away everything to keep out of that building. And I think you deserve to know exactly how far he was willing to go." If you've made it this far into the story, I want you to sit with that for a second, because I certainly had to. The forged compliance memos were the twist none of us saw coming. Not the SEC, not Patrice, not even me. Preston had been so desperate to make it look like Sterling had never actually needed me that he had committed a federal crime trying to prove it. I heard about the day the SEC's Enforcement Division actually showed up at Sterling's offices from Desmond, who was still technically employed there for another week before his resignation officially took effect, and who described the whole scene to me in a tone somewhere between disbelief and grim satisfaction. 3 investigators arrived on a Tuesday morning without any advance warning, presenting Preston's assistant with a formal document request and a subpoena for testimony, along with a notice that the agency would be conducting on-site interviews with senior staff over the following week. Preston, according to Desmond, attempted to intercept the investigators personally in the lobby, introducing himself as the acting CEO and offering, in what Desmond described as an almost comically transparent attempt at charm, to walk them through everything personally over lunch at a steakhouse a few blocks away. The lead investigator, a measured, unimpressed woman named Agent Ferris, reportedly informed Preston that federal document requests were not typically resolved over a meal, and that he would need to make his general counsel available immediately, along with unrestricted access to every device and account associated with Sterling's marketing and compliance functions. Preston, still apparently under the impression that his family's reputation could smooth over almost anything, tried once more, offering to have his father's old attorney make a call to someone he vaguely implied was a personal friend at the regional SEC office. A comment Desmond said visibly changed the tone of the entire room, since suggesting you can informally influence a federal investigation is, at best, a spectacularly poor idea, and at worst, its own separate problem entirely. Agent Ferris simply asked him, flatly, whether he wanted that comment included in the interview notes. Preston did not offer to make any more calls after that. The investigators spent the better part of 2 weeks going through Sterling's servers, email archives, and video content, building the exact timeline that would eventually connect Bianca's promotional posts directly to internal communications, instructing her on what figures to use. It was during that same document sweep, digging through backdated internal memos related to compliance sign-off procedures, that the forensic examiners first flagged irregularities in the digital timestamps on 2 supervisory documents supposedly authorizing Sterling's continued operations in my absence, documents that, on paper, appeared to bear my signature, dated weeks before I had actually left the firm, but which metadata clearly showed had been created and modified nearly 4 months later. That single technical inconsistency, buried in a routine document review, became the thread that eventually unraveled the far more serious case against Preston personally. Bianca's cooperation agreement became public 3 weeks later, when a business journalist broke the story under the headline, "Influencer Turns on Sterling Air, Hands SEC Evidence of Forged Compliance Documents." The story spread through Atlanta faster than the original rumor about my supposed embezzlement had, except this time, every single detail was true, documented, and backed by federal filings that anyone could pull up online. The forged memos changed everything about the scope of the investigation. What had started as a relatively contained inquiry into inflated performance claims on social media escalated into a full securities fraud case against Preston personally, with the Department of Justice's Atlanta field office opening a parallel criminal referral. Falsifying compliance records to obstruct a federal regulatory examination is not a civil matter you settle with a fine and an apology letter. It is the kind of charge that ends careers, freezes assets, and occasionally ends with a person standing in front of a judge instead of a boardroom. Within days, a federal judge granted the SEC's emergency motion to freeze Preston's personal assets, including the remaining balance of a trust his grandfather had established decades earlier, on the grounds that Preston posed a flight risk and had already demonstrated a willingness to falsify records to obstruct an active investigation. His bank accounts were frozen, his credit was destroyed. The lavish life he had spent his entire adult existence assuming was permanent, evaporated in the span of a single court order. I want to be honest with you about something, because I think it matters. I did not feel triumphant when I read that ruling. I felt something quieter and heavier than triumph. The specific, uncomfortable weight of watching a person's own choices catch up to them in real time, knowing there was nothing left for anyone, including me, to soften the landing. My mother called me that night. She had been following the story from her condo in Stone Mountain, the way she followed everything, with a cup of chamomile tea and absolutely no patience for foolishness. "You did not do this to him," she said, before I could even say anything. "I can hear it in your voice, Simone. You're sitting there feeling responsible for a grown man's decisions. Let me tell you something I should have told you a long time ago. Being good enough that they can't ignore you was never about protecting them from themselves. It was about protecting yourself from needing their permission to exist." I sat with that for a long time after we hung up. She was right. The way she was almost always right, in that maddening way mothers manage to be right about the exact thing you least want to hear. Bianca, meanwhile, was navigating her own reckoning. Her cooperation deal protected her from the most serious charges, but it did not protect her from the public. Brand partnerships she had spent years cultivating dissolved overnight. The detox tea company dropped her within 48 hours of the story breaking. A skincare brand issued a statement distancing itself entirely, citing concerns about association with ongoing federal litigation. Her once glossy feed, full of private jets and five-star hotel rooms, went quiet for almost 2 weeks before she reemerged with a single, carefully worded video acknowledging that she had made serious mistakes trusting the wrong people with my platform. A statement that managed to be both an apology and a subtle, precise blade aimed directly at Preston. She showed up at Sterling's now nearly empty headquarters one final time, the week the forged memo story broke. And it happened, by pure coincidence, on the same afternoon I was there myself, walking through the space with Patrice to finalize the last details of the office sublease Carter Capital was picking up, now that Sterling could no longer afford the lease on its own. Preston was there too, pacing near what used to be his father's old office, on the phone with someone, his voice climbing into a register I had never heard from him before, desperate, unguarded, stripped of every ounce of the performance he had built his entire identity around. Bianca walked in wearing sunglasses despite the overcast sky outside, her heels echoing sharply against the marble floor of a lobby that had once buzzed with 200 employees and now sat almost entirely empty. Preston saw her and rushed toward her, reaching for her hand. "Thank God you're here," he said, his voice thick with the particular panic of a man who had run out of every other person to turn to. "Tell them you'll testify that I never told you to forge anything. Tell them it was your idea to inflate the numbers, that I never even saw the videos before they went up. We can still fix this. I still have connections. My father's old attorneys owe him favors. We can hire outside counsel and fight this together." Bianca looked down at his outstretched hand like it belonged to someone she had never met. "Are you actually out of your mind right now?" she said, her voice sharp enough to cut through the empty lobby. "Your trust fund is gone, Preston. Frozen by a federal judge. You are broke. You are facing criminal charges for forging federal compliance documents, and you want me to lie under oath to protect you? You dragged me into a business I never should have touched in the first place. Told me I'd be running a whole new luxury division, and now I have a federal case with my name attached to it because you couldn't keep your ego in check long enough to just leave the woman who actually knew what she was doing alone. Bianca, please, he said, his voice dropping into something small and pleading. I did this for us. I fired her for us. She let out a short, brittle laugh, the sound of every carefully cultivated ounce of sweetness she had ever performed, finally cracking apart completely. You fired her because you couldn't stand that everyone respected her more than they respected you. I build a brand on success, Preston. I cannot be seen anywhere near a broke, disgraced man facing federal fraud charges. That's not who I am. She reached down and pulled the engagement ring off her finger. A ring I recognized instantly, because I had once approved the corporate card charge that paid for it during a period when the firm could barely cover payroll. Keep your repossessed jewelry, she said, and threw it at him. The stone struck him in the chest and clattered onto the marble floor, spinning in a tight circle before rolling to a stop near his shoes. She did not wait to watch him react. She turned on her heel and walked out, already pulling her phone from her bag, undoubtedly calling her attorney to make sure her cooperation agreement was airtight before the story could spin any further out of her control. The lobby fell completely silent. Preston stood alone in the wreckage of a life he had spent months insisting was permanent, staring down at a diamond ring on the floor of a building that no longer belonged to his family in anything but name. And the final, most devastating conversation of his life was still waiting for him, because his father had just been medically cleared to travel. If you were directing the final act of this story, this is exactly where you would lock the camera down completely. No handheld shakiness, no quick cuts, just a long, steady, unbroken shot, letting the silence of that empty marble lobby stretch out for as long as it needed to. Preston was still staring at the ring near his shoes when the front doors opened again. I heard the wheels before I saw him, a slow, deliberate squeak of rubber against polished stone. A private nurse pushed a wheelchair through the entrance, and sitting in it was Elliot Sterling, the man who had built this entire empire out of a rented office above a dry cleaner. The man who had introduced me to clients for a decade as the smartest person in any room he had ever built. He looked older than I remembered, visibly diminished by the heart attack and the months of recovery that followed it. The left side of his face drooped slightly when he spoke, and a thin cardigan hung looser on his frame than the tailored suits he used to wear. But his eyes, when they found his son standing alone in the wreckage of everything, were sharp enough to cut glass. He had been discharged from the rehabilitation facility 3 days earlier. Patrice, at my request, had made sure his medical team and his personal attorney kept him fully briefed on everything that had happened in his absence, every detail, no matter how much his doctors worried about his blood pressure. He had a right to know what his son had done to the company he spent 30 years building. He had read every filing. He had reviewed every account statement. He had listened to the audio Bianca handed over to investigators, the recording of his own son admitting to forging documents under his family's name. Preston's face flooded with a sick, desperate relief the moment he saw his father. He rushed across the lobby and dropped to his knees beside the wheelchair, grabbing the armrest like a drowning man reaching for driftwood. "Dad, thank God," Preston said, his voice cracking. "You have to help me. The SEC is trying to destroy me over things that weren't even my fault. Simone and Bianca turned on me. They're twisting everything. You have to call your lawyers. You have to fix this." Elliot did not reach for his son. He looked down at the 33-year-old man kneeling on the marble floor with an expression of profound, exhausted disgust. The kind that only comes from a parent who has spent decades making excuses for someone and has finally, completely, run out of them. He raised his right hand, the one that still worked properly, and the small gesture was enough to silence Preston's stream of excuses entirely. "You did not need anyone to conspire against you, Preston," Elliot said. His voice was slower than I remembered, roughened by the stroke, but every ounce of authority in it was still intact. "You did this to yourself. Every single piece of it. I built this firm from nothing because I was tired of watching men who looked like me get shut out of rooms where real money changed hands. I gave you the best education money could buy. I gave you a title, a salary, and access to a business it took me 30 years to build. And the first real test of your character, the very first one, you failed so completely that you forged documents under my company's name to cover for your own arrogance." "Dad, I am not finished," Elliot said, and something in his tone made even the empty lobby seem to hold its breath. "You are not a victim in this story, Preston. You are the reason this story happened at all. Simone kept this firm alive twice. Once when my finances put it at risk, and once when my body did. You had one job when I was in that hospital bed. One! Do not destroy what I built. And you could not manage even that." He paused, drawing a slow, labored breath, and I watched something in his face harden into a decision he had clearly already made before he ever walked through those doors. "My attorneys finalized a full revision of my estate 3 days ago," Elliot said. "You are no longer a beneficiary of my personal trust. You will not inherit this company because there is no longer a company left to inherit that carries my name. You are disinherited, effective immediately. Whatever is left of your legal troubles, you will face them with your own resources because you will not be using another dollar of mine to do it." Preston collapsed back onto his heels, sobbing openly in the middle of the same lobby where, 4 months earlier, he had triumphantly watched me get escorted out by security. Elliot did not comfort him. He slowly turned his gaze away from his son and found me standing near the far wall beside Patrice. "Simone," he said, his voice softening just slightly, "you played this exactly right. You built an ironclad position, and you executed it without a single wasted move. I cannot fault you for capitalizing on his incompetence. You won this fair and square, and God knows you earned it 100 times over before he ever gave you a reason to use it." He drew another slow breath, his eyes drifting briefly to his son, still crumpled on the floor. "But I am asking you for one thing," he said. "As the man who gave you your very first opportunity in this industry, when you were 23 years old and nobody else would even interview you. He is broke. He has federal charges attached to his name. He will lose everything, including whatever dignity he has left by the end of this year. I am not asking you to forgive him. I am asking you to consider giving him some kind of position, somewhere, in whatever you build next. Nothing with authority, nothing with access to client funds. A file clerk, a records assistant, anything, just so my son does not end up with absolutely nothing to his name." I looked at this proud, broken man, sitting in a wheelchair in the lobby of the empire he had spent 30 years building, asking me for mercy on behalf of the son who had spent 5 months trying to destroy everything I had built alongside him. I thought about my mother's voice on the phone a few weeks earlier, telling me that being good enough that they could not ignore me was never about protecting anyone else from their own choices. I did not answer right away. I let the silence sit there, heavy and honest, the way I had learned to let silence do its own work over 11 years of high-stakes negotiations. "I'll think about it," I finally said, and I meant it, honestly, without any promise attached to it. "Not because he deserves it, Elliot. He doesn't, and we both know that. But because you're right that I remember what it felt like to be 23 years old and desperate for someone to give me a chance nobody else would. I'll think about it." Elliot nodded slowly, and something in his shoulders eased slightly, the smallest release of a weight he had clearly been carrying since he first woke up in that hospital bed and started piecing together everything his son had done in his absence. I did not look at Preston, still crumpled on the floor. I did not look back at Elliot's wheelchair as the nurse turned to guide him back toward the door. I walked past both of them, out through the same revolving doors I had walked through 4 months earlier as a woman who had just been fired, and back out into the thick, humid Atlanta air as a woman who now employed 14 people, managed over $1.8 billion in client assets, and had just watched an empire built on entitlement collapse under the weight of its own arrogance. If you've ever watched someone underestimate exactly who they were dealing with, right up until the moment it cost them absolutely everything, let me know in the comments, because I promise you, this is far from the only time I've seen it happen. The months that followed moved faster than I expected. Carter Capital Management grew from 14 employees to 31 within the first year, as former Sterling clients told their friends, and their friends told their business partners, and the story of the firm that had actually protected its clients' money through a corporate collapse became its own quiet form of advertising in a community where trust travels through word of mouth faster than any marketing campaign ever could. Desmond Reeves became my head of trading operations officially, with a title and a compensation package that finally matched the 11 years of expertise he had spent building somewhere else. I promoted 2 of the junior analysts who had followed me over from Sterling into their first real portfolio management roles, the same way someone had once given me my first real chance at 23. Before I found that new office space, I did something Elliot had never once done in 30 years of running Sterling. I took the entire 14-person founding team of Carter Capital, everyone from Desmond down to the newest hire we'd brought on just weeks earlier, to a weekend retreat at a lake house outside Athens, Georgia, not to talk about strategy or targets, but simply to let everyone breathe after 4 consecutive months of building something under enormous pressure, with almost no time to process any of it. We sat around a fire pit on the first night, and I asked everyone, one by one, to share the specific moment during the collapse that had stuck with them the most. Priya talked about the night she sent me that message, offering to answer phones, not knowing if it would ever lead anywhere, just knowing she needed to say it out loud. Marcus talked about knocking on my car window in that parking deck, terrified he was making a career-ending mistake, and deciding to do it anyway. Desmond, uncharacteristically emotional for a man who usually kept his composure locked down tighter than any trading terminal, talked about the exact moment he realized, watching those account statuses flip from green to red on his monitor, that 11 years of assuming Sterling stability had been resting entirely on a woman nobody in that building had ever properly credited. I told them my own moment, the 2 a.m. phone call with Tasha, sitting on my apartment floor surrounded by half-finished filings, wondering if I actually had the strength to keep going. I told them that the version of the story people were going to eventually hear, the confident woman who calmly revoked an entire firm's operating authority from a parking deck, was true. But it was not the whole truth, and that the whole truth included plenty of moments where I did not feel calm or confident at all. I wanted them to understand that building something real is never as clean as the highlight reel makes it look, and that admitting exhaustion is not the same thing as admitting weakness. That retreat became an annual tradition. We still do it every summer, the same lake house, the same fire pit, though the guest list has grown considerably larger. I made one more deliberate choice when I finally moved the firm into that proper office suite. Something small that ended up mattering more than I expected. I named every single conference room after a client whose story had shaped how I approached this work, rather than after some generic word meant to sound impressive on a floor plan. The largest room is called Whitfield, after Carl. The smaller room, where we handle new client onboarding, is called Grant, after Odessa. There is a room called Halloway, for the judge who found me by the coat check, and one called Nia, my mother's actual first name, which almost nobody outside our family knew until I put it on a brass plaque outside a conference room door. Every new hire gets a short explanation of who each room is named for during their first week. Not because it is required, but because I wanted the culture of this firm to be built on specific people, rather than abstract values nobody could actually picture. I moved the firm into a proper office suite on the 11th floor of a building downtown, and on my first day walking into that space, I hung a single framed photograph behind my desk. My mother, in her claims adjuster uniform, standing in front of the insurance office where she worked for 30 years. The same photo I had carried with me from that first tiny conference room with the folding chairs. I did think about what Elliot asked me. 6 months after that conversation in the empty Sterling lobby, once Preston had pleaded guilty to a reduced set of charges in exchange for cooperation with the ongoing investigation, once the sentencing had concluded with probation, restitution, and a permanent bar from ever working in a regulated financial role again, I reached out to Elliot directly. Not to offer his son a job managing anything, but to fund, quietly and without his name attached to it, a modest paid apprenticeship program at Carter Capital for young people from underserved Atlanta neighborhoods who wanted a path into finance, but had nobody willing to give them a first chance. I told Elliot that was the closest thing to mercy I had left to offer. Mercy aimed at people who actually deserved a chance, built from the ashes of the one who had squandered his own. Elliot cried when I told him. I did not expect that from a man who had spent 30 years building an empire on the principle of never letting anyone see him break. Preston, as far as I know, eventually found work doing something unrelated to finance entirely. Somewhere quieter, somewhere far away from the industry that had once handed him everything, and then watched him burn it to the ground with his own 2 hands. I do not know exactly where he ended up, and I stopped needing to know. A year after that first Tuesday morning in the glass conference room, the Pediatric Cancer Foundation that had once quietly asked me to step down from its executive committee reached out again, this time to invite me back, along with a formal apology from Regina Hollis, who admitted, in a private phone call I did not ask for but did not refuse either, that the board had acted on rumor rather than character, and that they hoped I would consider forgiving an organization that had ultimately been more interested in a bigger check than the truth. I said yes. Not because I had forgotten what it felt like to be steered toward the exit corridor of a ballroom I had helped fund for 3 straight years, but because the children that foundation served had never done anything wrong, and cutting off my support to punish a room full of adults who had briefly failed a character test was never going to be the kind of person I wanted to be. I went back to that gala the following spring, wearing the same deep emerald I had worn the night I was pushed toward the door. And this time, I sat at table 1 in my own seat, surrounded by people who had finally learned exactly whose company they should have trusted all along. Let me back up for a moment, because I don't think you can really understand why any of this hit me the way it did without understanding how I got that first real chance in the first place. I was 23, 6 months into my job as a junior analyst at Sterling, still learning the difference between a qualified retirement plan and a non-qualified one, when Elliot handed me a client file that every senior person in the office had quietly avoided for months. The client was a retired NFL offensive lineman named Carl Whitfield, a proud, guarded man in his early 60s who had been burned twice before by advisors who talked down to him, oversold him on complicated products he didn't understand, and disappeared the moment the market got rocky. Carl had almost $4 million sitting in a checking account earning nothing because he trusted exactly nobody in finance anymore. And he had already fired 2 advisors at Sterling before I ever walked into the room. I did not try to impress him with jargon. I sat across from him at his kitchen table in Decatur, brought printed diagrams instead of a slideshow, and spent 3 hours just listening before I said a single word about strategy. I asked him what actually scared him about money, not what returns he wanted. He told me he was terrified of outliving his savings the way his own father had, working until the day he died because nobody had ever explained compound interest to him in a way that made sense. I built him a plan around that fear specifically. Conservative, transparent, reviewed with him line by line every single quarter for as long as he wanted. No surprises, no products he couldn't explain back to me in his own words. Carl stayed with Sterling for the rest of his life. He referred 11 other former players to me over the following decade, several of whom became some of the firm's largest accounts. Elliot used to tell that story at every new employee orientation, holding it up as the exact model of what trust actually looks like in this business. It was the first real proof I had that hard work paired with genuine care could out-earn charm and connections every single time. A lesson that would matter enormously 4 months into the disaster with Preston, when Carl's son, Deshaun, a rising defensive back who had inherited his father's accounts after Carl passed 2 years earlier, found himself caught directly in the crossfire of the collapse. Deshaun was 26, newly signed to a significant contract extension, and had roughly $6 million sitting in accounts that had been frozen the same Wednesday morning as everyone else's. Preston, sensing an opportunity to save face with one of the firm's most visible remaining clients, personally called Deshaun and invited him to a private dinner where Bianca, according to what Deshaun told me himself weeks later, spent most of the evening talking about a new athlete wealth acceleration program she was launching, promising guaranteed returns that no legitimate registered advisor would ever put in writing, let alone say out loud at a dinner table. According to Deshaun, the dinner itself had been staged with almost theatrical precision. A private room at one of the city's most exclusive steakhouses, a bottle of wine that probably cost more than most people's monthly car payment, and a slideshow presentation Bianca had put together herself, full of glossy graphics showing hypothetical growth charts that curved upward in a smooth, suspiciously perfect line no real market has ever actually produced. Preston had spent most of the dinner talking about legacy, about generational wealth, about being the kind of partner who actually understands athletes, while carefully avoiding any specific mention of the fact that his own firm's accounts had been frozen for weeks by that point. Deshaun called me the next morning, his voice tight with confusion. "Simone, some woman just told me she can double my money in 18 months with 0 risk. That doesn't sound right to me. My dad used to talk about you like you walked on water. What's actually going on over there?" I told him the truth, plainly and without exaggeration, the same way I always had with his father. I explained the registration structure, the freeze, the reason his accounts were locked, and exactly what guaranteed returns with zero risk actually meant under federal securities law, which is to say, it is a phrase that should never come out of the mouth of anyone legally permitted to manage your money, because guarantees like that simply do not exist in real markets. Your father built his entire plan around one thing, I told him. Never trust anyone selling you certainty. The market doesn't offer certainty. It offers strategy, patience, and someone who tells you the truth, even when the truth is boring. Deshaun transferred his accounts to Carter Capital that same week, becoming one of my first major clients at the new firm, and 6 weeks later, one of the athletes who very publicly and very deliberately gave an interview to a local sports outlet describing exactly why he had moved his family's money away from Sterling. An interview that did more damage to Preston's remaining credibility in Atlanta's athletic community than almost anything else that happened during that entire collapse. I think about Carl Whitfield often, honestly. I think about how a decision I made at 23, sitting at a kitchen table in Decatur, listening more than I talked, ended up protecting his son's fortune more than a decade later in a boardroom crisis neither of us could have possibly predicted. My mother always said that character compounds the same way money does, quietly, invisibly, for years, until one day it either saves you or it doesn't. I got to watch mine save an entire company. I want to pause the story here for a second and talk directly to you, because I think this part matters more than the legal maneuvering or the boardroom drama. If you're a Black woman in any kind of demanding professional field, law, medicine, finance, doesn't matter, you already know the specific exhaustion of being simultaneously indispensable and invisible. You know what it feels like to be the person everyone quietly relies on to keep the entire operation from falling apart, while somehow still being treated as replaceable the second someone with less experience and more charisma walks into the room. I spent 11 years being told, in a dozen small ways, that my value was in my competence, not my presence. I was the person who fixed things quietly, who never made a scene, who kept the trains running so smoothly that eventually people forgot there was an engineer at all. Preston's mistake wasn't just underestimating my legal position. It was the deeper, more common mistake of assuming that quiet competence means an absence of power, that a woman who does her job without demanding constant recognition for it has somehow forgotten her own worth. I hadn't forgotten. I had simply been patient, the way my mother taught me to be patient, building armor one credential at a time for exactly the moment when patience would no longer serve me and I would need something sharper. A local business journal reached out to me about 6 weeks after the story of Sterling's collapse became public, asking if I would sit for an interview about what had happened. I almost said no. Part of me wanted to just keep building quietly and let the facts speak entirely for themselves, the way I always had. But my mother, when I called to ask her opinion, said something I have not forgotten since. "Baby, you spent 11 years teaching people how to underestimate you because it kept the peace," she said. "You don't owe anyone your silence anymore. Tell the truth. Let it be loud for once." The journalist who conducted the interview, a woman named Keisha Bramwell, who had covered Atlanta's business community for almost 15 years, asked me one question near the end that I still think about regularly. "Do you ever worry," she asked, "that telling the story publicly makes you look vindictive rather than simply victorious?" I told her the truth. I said that for most of my career, I had watched women who looked like me get punished twice for the exact same situation. once for the original mistreatment, and a second time for daring to describe it plainly afterward, as though naming an injustice out loud was somehow a greater offense than committing it in the first place. I told her I had decided, somewhere around the second month of rebuilding a firm from 3 folding chairs, that I was done managing other people's comfort at the expense of my own honesty. If the full, accurate truth of what happened made anyone uncomfortable, I said, that discomfort belonged to the people who had built a company on the assumption that quiet women simply absorb whatever is done to them without ever speaking up. Keisha nodded slowly, writing something in her notebook before looking back up at me. For what it's worth, she said, closing her notebook, I've interviewed a lot of executives in this city over the years. Most of them talk about winning like it's the only part of the story worth telling. You're the first one who's ever talked to me about the 2 a.m. phone call, too. I told her that was probably the most important thing I would ever say in that entire interview, and it turned out to be the single quote that got shared the most once the piece finally ran. So I did the interview. I talked about Carl Whitfield and the kitchen table in Decatur. I talked about the 90-hour weeks during Elliot's recovery. I talked, carefully and without naming every detail that was still under investigation, about what it felt like to build something for over a decade and be told, in the same week I saved it from collapse, that I was just a hired hand who had gotten too comfortable. The interview ran with the headline, "The Woman Who Actually Owned the License All Along," and it was shared, reposted, and discussed across every corner of Atlanta's professional community for weeks. Young Black women in finance messaged me for months afterward, some just starting their careers, some senior enough to have their own version of a Preston story. All of them telling me some variation of the same thing. Thank you for showing us what it looks like to win quietly and then say so out loud. If any part of this story resonates with you, if you have ever been the person holding an entire operation together while someone else took credit for simply showing up, I want you to know that patience is not the same thing as weakness. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is nothing at all, until the exact moment when doing nothing stops being an option. Behind the scenes, Sterling's remaining board members did not go down without a final chaotic scramble of their own. 3 weeks after the SEC investigation became public, the 4 remaining independent board members, none of whom had spoken up when Preston installed himself as acting CEO without proper authorization in the first place, called an emergency session to formally strip him of his title. A decision that arrived roughly 2 months too late to matter, since by that point there was almost no firm left for the title to govern. 2 of the 4 resigned outright within days, citing reputational risk, a phrase that always makes me laugh a little considering none of them had shown a shred of concern about reputational risk when they let a 33-year-old with 0 operational experience seize control of a licensed financial institution without so much as a formal vote. Elliot, still recovering and legally barred by his own doctors from resuming any active management role, made one final decision as founder before stepping back entirely. He voted, along with the 2 remaining board members, to formally dissolve Sterling Wealth Partners as a business entity, rather than attempt any kind of rebuild. The firm's remaining assets, minus legal fees and regulatory penalties, were liquidated. The name that had once represented 30 years of hard-won trust in Atlanta's Black professional community quietly ceased to exist. Not with a dramatic announcement, but with a short, formal filing buried in a state business registry that almost nobody but Patrice and I ever bothered to read. I want to be honest with you about something else, because I think too many of these stories skip straight from humiliation to triumph without admitting the messy middle part. There was a night, About 10 days after I was walked out of that building, when none of it felt like winning yet. It just felt like free fall. I remember sitting on the floor of my apartment at almost 2 in the morning, laptop open on the coffee table, surrounded by half-finished regulatory filings for Carter Capital, a legal pad covered in notes about client transfer forms, and a glass of wine I hadn't touched in an hour because I kept forgetting it was there. I had spent 11 years building an identity around being the person who fixed everything, and for one long, quiet night, I let myself feel the full weight of how exhausted I actually was underneath all that competence. I called my best friend Tasha, a labor and delivery nurse who has known me since we were 19 years old, sharing a dorm room at Spelman, and who has exactly zero patience for my tendency to minimize how hard something actually is. "You've built an entire company from scratch in 10 days, she said, when I finally admitted, quietly, that I wasn't sure I could keep this pace up much longer. "You buried a decade of your life inside a firm that let a grown man call you a hired hand in front of witnesses. You are allowed to be tired, Simone. Being tired doesn't mean you're losing. It just means you're human. And apparently nobody at that company ever bothered to notice you were one." She stayed on the phone with me for almost 2 hours that night, not offering solutions, mostly just letting me talk through the parts of the story that never made it into any legal filing. The specific sting of watching security guards I had personally hired avoid my eyes. The particular loneliness of walking through a ballroom full of people who had known me for years and chose gossip over evidence. The strange grief of losing a workplace I had genuinely loved building, even after everything Preston had done to it. I tell you this part not because it changes anything about the outcome, but because I think it matters for anyone listening to this who is in the middle of their own version of free fall right now. Still in the part of the story where nothing feels resolved yet. You do not have to feel triumphant every single day to eventually end up somewhere powerful. Sometimes you just have to survive the 2 a.m. conversations long enough to get to the boardroom where everything finally clicks back into place. By the following spring, Carter Capital Management had grown to manage just over $2.1 billion in client assets, surpassing, for the first time, the peak Sterling Wealth Partners had ever reached under Elliott's 30 years of leadership. I signed a lease on a full floor of office space downtown, hired a proper director of human resources so I would never again have to personally manage every single hiring decision at 2 in the morning, and finally, for the first time in almost a year, started sleeping through the night without waking up at 3 a.m., running through compliance checklists in my head. There is one more piece of this story I have to tell you, because it is the part that almost derailed everything I had built, and it came from a direction I genuinely did not see coming. About 8 months after Carter Capital officially launched, once the story of Sterling's collapse had been thoroughly picked apart by every financial publication in the Southeast, a much larger national wealth management conglomerate based out of Charlotte reached out with an acquisition offer. The offer was substantial, enough zeros that Patrice actually sat back in her chair the first time she read it out loud. They wanted to absorb Carter Capital entirely, keep me on as a regional managing director with a significant equity package, and fold my client base into their much larger national platform. On paper, it looked like exactly the kind of outcome most people build a company hoping to eventually reach: a clean, lucrative exit after surviving a brutal corporate war. I sat with the offer for almost 3 weeks. I ran the numbers a dozen different ways. I talked it through with Desmond, with Patrice, with my mother, who, predictably, refused to tell me what to do and instead asked me a single question that ended up mattering more than any spreadsheet. When Carl Whitfield sat at his kitchen table and told you he was scared of dying broke like his father, she said, did you build that plan for him because it was profitable or because it mattered to you? I turned the acquisition down, not because the money wasn't real, and not because growth under a larger platform would have been the wrong decision for everyone in my position, but because the entire reason Carter Capital existed in the first place was rooted in something Elliot had originally understood before his son ever walked into that boardroom, that there is a specific, irreplaceable value in a wealth management firm built by and rooted inside the community it actually serves, where the person managing your family's future understands, on a personal level, exactly what generational financial security means to families who have historically been locked out of it. I called the acquisition team and declined politely, then spent that weekend at a small community financial literacy workshop I had started hosting quarterly at a rec center in southwest Atlanta, not far from the dry cleaner above which Elliot had once rented his very first office. I stood in front of 40 people, most of them young, most of them the first in their families ever taught anything about compound interest or retirement accounts, and I taught the exact same lesson I had once taught Carl Whitfield at his kitchen table. Never trust anyone selling you certainty, and always understand exactly whose name is actually on the paperwork before you trust them with anything that matters. That workshop eventually became the foundation of what I now call the Whitfield Fellowship, a paid apprenticeship and mentorship pipeline at Carter Capital, named for the client whose trust had first taught me what real loyalty in this business actually looks like. We have graduated 11 fellows through the program so far, 4 of whom now work full-time on my team, learning the exact same lesson I learned at 23. That competence, patience, and genuine care for the people you serve will always, eventually, out-earn charm. As for Preston, I heard through the same social circles that had once turned their backs on me at that charity gala that he eventually took a job managing inventory at a logistics warehouse outside of Marietta, a quiet, unglamorous position about as far removed from private boardrooms and yacht photos as a person could possibly land. I do not know if that story is entirely accurate, and honestly, I stopped needing to track his life closely enough to find out for certain. Elliot, for his part, recovered well enough over the following year to travel again, though he never returned to active leadership in any financial business. He visits the Whitfield Fellowship Program twice a year now, speaking to the newest cohort of apprentices about the 30 years it took him to build something worth protecting, and the single afternoon it took his own son to nearly destroy it. Before I get into the trial, I have to tell you about the 48 hours right after the freeze hit, because that stretch of time taught me more about who actually respected me than the previous 11 years combined. By Thursday morning, less than a day after the accounts froze, someone inside Sterling, to this day I still don't know exactly who, though I have a fairly strong guess, leaked an internal memo to a popular Atlanta business gossip account on Instagram, the kind of page that mixes real financial reporting with just enough unverified speculation to keep 200,000 followers checking it obsessively. The post claimed Sterling Wealth Partners was facing an unprecedented internal crisis and included a screenshot of an internal Slack channel where panicked employees were asking whether they should update their resumes. Within hours, the post had thousands of shares, and comment sections across half a dozen finance-adjacent accounts were filled with speculation ranging from embezzlement to a hostile takeover to, absurdly, rumors that the firm had been secretly insolvent for years. My phone did not stop buzzing that entire day. Reporters I had never spoken to before found my personal number somehow and left voicemails asking for comment. A few former colleagues from my early banking days reached out just to check if I was okay, having seen my name mentioned in a comment thread beneath the leaked post, someone speculating I had been the one who sabotaged the whole thing on her way out the door. A rumor that, ironically, was both completely wrong about my motive and completely correct about my leverage. I made the deliberate decision, on Patrice's advice, not to respond publicly to any of it yet. Fighting a social media narrative with another social media narrative rarely works in a regulated industry, where every public statement carries potential legal exposure. Instead, I let the actual paperwork do the talking, quietly filing the necessary transfer authorizations with our custodian banks, while the internet argued about a story none of them had the full picture of yet. What I did not expect, in the middle of all that noise, was the wave of staff who started reaching out privately within those same 48 hours, well before I had even decided for certain that I was building anything new. Priya Nair, a junior compliance analyst who had been at Sterling less than 2 years, sent me a message that just said, "Whatever you're doing next, I want in, even if it's just answering phones." Marcus Delian, one of our client service associates, drove to the parking deck where I had been sitting during the freeze. He had guessed correctly that I would still be nearby, and knocked on my car window just to ask if there was anything he could do to help, even before he understood what help would actually mean. I did not hire either of them that week. I did not have a firm yet, let alone payroll to offer anyone. But I remembered every single one of those messages when Carter Capital finally opened its doors, and both Priya and Marcus were among the very first calls I made once I had an actual offer letter to send. There is a specific kind of loyalty that shows up before there's anything to gain from it, and I have never forgotten which of my former colleagues showed up for me during the exact 48 hours when showing up cost them something real. A job at a firm still technically employing them if they'd been caught helping the person that firm had just publicly fired. Preston, for his part, spent those same 48 hours trying to control the narrative from the opposite direction, giving a rushed, poorly prepared interview to a local business reporter in which he described the situation as a temporary operational transition and insisted client assets remained completely secure, a statement that was technically true, but conveniently omitted the fact that not a single one of those assets could actually be traded, withdrawn, or managed by anyone at his firm. The reporter, sensing something didn't add up, kept digging, which is precisely how she eventually found her way to Bianca's promotional videos 3 weeks later, and handed the SEC exactly the lead they needed. I have to back up and tell you about the trial, because I don't think you can fully appreciate how thoroughly Preston's world collapsed without seeing the inside of that federal courtroom for yourself. The criminal proceedings took almost 7 months to reach a resolution, which, for a federal securities fraud case involving forged compliance documents, is actually remarkably fast, mostly because Preston's attorney, once he finally hired one separate from Sterling's corporate counsel, understood immediately that fighting the charges outright was a losing strategy. Bianca's recordings were airtight. The forensic handwriting analysis on the backdated memos was conclusive. The forged documents bore a digital timestamp that placed their creation nearly 4 months after I had left the firm, which made the entire cover story Preston had originally tried to sell his father, that Sterling had always had proper supervisory documentation in place, impossible to defend under any interpretation of the evidence. I was called to testify during the SEC's civil proceeding, which ran on a parallel track to the criminal case, and I remember sitting in the witness box across from a federal attorney I had never met, answering questions about registration structures and fiduciary responsibility that I had explained to clients 1,000 times over the years. Except this time, the stakes were a man's freedom rather than a family's retirement account. I did not enjoy testifying. I want to be honest about that. There is no part of watching someone's life unravel in a federal courtroom that feels like triumph. even when the person unraveling it earned every bit of it through his own choices. Preston sat at the defense table throughout both proceedings in a suit that had clearly been altered to fit his newly thinner frame, and he did not once look in my direction during my testimony, not even when the prosecutor asked me directly to explain, in plain language, exactly what it meant for a registered investment advisor's chief compliance officer to be legally required to sign off on supervisory documentation. Documentation Preston had personally forged using a signature stamp he had taken from my old desk drawer without ever asking. The judge, during sentencing, made a comment I have not forgotten. She said that what struck her most about the case was not the scale of the fraud, which was, in the broader landscape of federal securities cases, relatively modest, but the sheer unnecessary cruelty of it. A young man who had inherited every conceivable advantage, choosing, when faced with the first real consequence of his own incompetence, to forge documents rather than simply admit fault and rebuild honestly. Preston received 5 years of probation, a substantial restitution order, a permanent bar from the securities industry, and, perhaps most tellingly, a public record that would follow him through every background check for the rest of his professional life. I remember one exchange from the sentencing hearing more vividly than almost anything else from that entire year. Before the judge issued her ruling, she gave Preston the opportunity to address the court directly, a standard procedure his attorney had clearly coached him through extensively. He stood, buttoned his jacket, and delivered a short statement about taking full responsibility, about the pressure of stepping into his father's shoes too quickly, about wanting to use this experience to become a better person. It was, on its face, exactly the kind of statement meant to soften a judge's ruling. But the judge, a woman named Patricia Ellsworth, who had clearly read every page of the case file with far more attention than Preston had ever given a single sterling client account, was not particularly moved. "Mr. Sterling," she said, looking at him directly over the top of her glasses, "you did not stumble into this situation. You were handed by your own account today every possible advantage a young man in this country could ask for. An elite education, a functioning business with 400 existing relationships already built for you, and a chief operating officer with 11 years of flawless regulatory history standing directly in front of you, ready to help you succeed. You chose, when tested for the very first time, to remove the one person capable of protecting you from your own inexperience, replace her with someone equally inexperienced, but considerably more agreeable to your ego, and then forge federal compliance documents rather than simply admit you had made a mistake. This is not a story about pressure. It is a story about a man who mistook other people's competence for his own birthright, and I intend to sentence you accordingly." I was not in the courtroom for the sentencing itself, having testified only during the earlier proceedings, but Patrice was there, and she called me the moment it ended, reading me the judge's exact words from her notes, because she knew, correctly, that I would want to hear them precisely as spoken, rather than paraphrased secondhand. Bianca avoided criminal charges entirely under her cooperation agreement, though the SEC still levied a significant civil penalty against her personally for the unregistered touting violations, along with a permanent bar from ever promoting investment products publicly again. I heard, secondhand, that she eventually relocated to Miami and rebuilt a smaller version of her old platform around fitness content instead, a category with considerably less federal oversight. There was one more attempt to derail everything I had built, and it came from a direction I genuinely did not expect. About 4 months after Carter Capital opened its doors, a woman named Renata Cole, who had briefly worked as Sterling's head of client relations before quietly resigning during the collapse, reached out to several of my largest clients directly, claiming to represent a new, unnamed advisory startup and suggesting, with just enough plausible deniability to avoid outright defamation, that Carter Capital's rapid growth had been built on questionable methods, and that clients should consider a more thorough due diligence review before committing further assets. I found out about it because Deshawn, of all people, called me laughing about it, telling me some woman had cold emailed him with vague insinuations about my business practices, and he had simply forwarded the email to Patrice without bothering to respond. Patrice traced the email domain back to a shell company registered, unsurprisingly, to an address associated with Renata's brother, who, it turned out, had been quietly dating Bianca's old marketing assistant, someone who still harbored resentment over losing her job when Sterling collapsed, and, it seemed, had decided the easiest way to feel relevant again was to try to poach a handful of clients under someone else's name. It amounted to nothing in the end. Patrice sent a single cease and desist letter, and the vague smear campaign evaporated within a week, mostly because every client who received one of those emails did exactly what Deshawn did. They laughed, forwarded it to my office, and stayed exactly where they were. If anything, it reminded me that no matter how thoroughly you win, there will always be someone standing just outside the frame, hoping to profit off whatever wreckage is left behind. And the only real defense against that is the same thing that got me through the entire ordeal in the first place. A reputation built on 11 years of actually doing right by the people who trusted me, long before any of them ever needed proof. I should also tell you, because a few of you have already asked in earlier videos whenever I mention any part of this story, that I did eventually start seeing someone again, about a year after everything with Sterling fell apart. His name is Adrian, he's a structural engineer, and he had absolutely no connection to finance, private wealth, or Atlanta's social club circuit whatsoever. Which honestly might be exactly why it worked. We met at, of all places, a hardware store, both of us standing in the same aisle trying to figure out which drill was actually worth the money, and he made me laugh within the first 4 minutes of conversation for the first time in longer than I wanted to admit. I did not tell him who I was for almost 3 full dates. Not because I was hiding anything, but because for the first time in over a year, I wanted to know what it felt like to be liked for something other than my title, my client list, or the story everyone in the city already seemed to know about me. When I finally did tell him, sitting across from him at a quiet restaurant on the west side, walking him through the entire saga, the boardroom, the license, the freeze, the gala, all of it, he listened without interrupting once. And when I finished, he asked me a single question that told me everything I needed to know about him. "Does the Mercy job offer still stand for warehouse work in Marietta?" he asked, completely deadpan. "Or is that position filled?" I laughed so hard I nearly knocked over my water glass. Adrian has never once, in the 2 years since, made me feel like my competence was something to apologize for, or my success was something that needed managing around his ego. He shows up to the Whitfield Fellowship graduation ceremonies every year without being asked, and he has never once suggested, even jokingly, that he might know how to run any part of my business better than I do. It turns out that was always the actual bar. It just took losing everything once to finally understand how low most of the men before him had been setting it. I should tell you about the day everything finally felt complete, because I think every story like this deserves one clean, deliberate moment where the past and the present sit in the same room together, and you get to watch exactly what you built stand next to exactly what you lost. It happened almost exactly 1 year to the day after that Wednesday morning in Sterling's glass conference room, at the ribbon cutting for Carter Capital's new headquarters, a full-floor office space downtown with our own name etched into brushed steel letters above the entrance, visible from the street the same way Sterling's logo used to be visible from 3 blocks away. I had invited clients, staff, my mother, Tasha, Desmond and his wife, and, on something between a professional courtesy and a genuine impulse I still can't fully explain, Elliot Sterling himself. He arrived in a wheelchair, though he had regained enough strength by then to stand briefly with assistance, and he insisted on doing exactly that when it came time for him to speak. He stood, with a cane in one hand and a nurse steadying his other arm, in front of a room full of people who had once trusted his name with their entire financial future. And he said something I have replayed in my head more times than I probably should admit. "I spent 30 years building something I was proud to put my name on," he said, his voice still rough from the stroke, but carrying clearly across the room. "And in the end, the thing I am most proud of having built was never the firm itself. It was the woman who was smart enough, patient enough, and prepared enough to make sure my life's work survived the one mistake I made that almost destroyed it. Simone, I am sorry it took my son's failure for the entire city to finally see what I already knew about you 11 years ago. You did not just save my company. You built a better one." I did not cry in front of that room, mostly out of 11 years of professional habit, but I came close enough that Tasha handed me a tissue from 3 feet away without even being asked. My mother, standing near the back of the room in a navy dress she had bought specifically for the occasion, caught my eye across the crowd and gave me a small, knowing nod. The exact same nod she used to give me when I brought home a report card full of grades she expected, rather than grades she was surprised by. She never made a big show of pride, not once in my entire life, because she believed excellence should be the baseline rather than the exception. But that nod told me everything her words never needed to. Desmond raised a glass later that evening and told the room, half joking and half completely serious, that he had personally watched 2 different men underestimate the same woman within the span of 18 months, and that he intended to spend the rest of his career making sure nobody made that particular mistake a 3rd time on his watch. Later that evening, after most of the guests had left and the catering staff had started clearing the last of the champagne glasses, I found myself standing alone near the window of my new office, looking out over the same Atlanta skyline I had once viewed from Sterling's 14th floor. Except this time, from a building with my own name etched above the door. I thought about my mother. 30 years at an insurance company that almost let her go twice, making herself impossible to ignore and impossible to replace, one careful decision at a time. I thought about Carl Whitfield's kitchen table in Decatur, and Deshawn's phone call the morning after that ill-fated dinner, and Desmond's simple 2-week notice, and Bianca's shaking voice on the phone admitting exactly how far Preston had been willing to go to erase me from a story I had built with my own hands. I picked up a champagne flute someone had left behind on the windowsill, still half full, and I raised it toward the skyline, toward the glass building 3 blocks away that no longer had a single client left inside it, toward a decade of being underestimated by people who mistook my patience for weakness and my quiet competence for something they were entitled to take from me. Elliot, you always told me that in this business, you take the risk, you pay the price. Sterling doesn't exist anymore. Welcome to Carter Capital. I want to close this out properly, because I know some of you are going to ask in the comments what actually happened to everyone after that ribbon cutting. So let me give you the full picture, exactly as it stands today, 2 years removed from the morning I got called into that glass conference room and told I was just a hired hand. Carter Capital Management now manages just over $2.6 billion in client assets, with a staff of 42, including 11 graduates or current fellows from the Whitfield Fellowship Program. Desmond Reeves eventually became a full partner in the firm, with his name added to our formal registration alongside mine, something I insisted on the moment his contributions justified it, because I never wanted to build the exact same kind of single point of failure structure that had once made me indispensable and invisible at the same time. We now have 3 registered principals, not 1. Specifically so that no future version of this story could ever happen to anyone on my team the way it happened to me. Patrice, my attorney, eventually became Carter Capital's general counsel full-time, walking away from her private practice once our internal legal needs grew large enough to justify it. She still keeps a framed copy of the original sub-advisory agreement, the one with the termination clause buried on page 41, hanging in her office, half as a joke and half as a permanent reminder to every new associate she trains of exactly how much power sits inside language most people never bother to actually read. Elliot Sterling passed away peacefully 18 months after that ribbon cutting, following complications from a second, smaller stroke. I was one of the speakers at his funeral, standing in front of a church filled with 3 generations of Atlanta's Black professional community, many of whom had built their family's entire financial foundation on the trust he first established decades earlier in that tiny rented office above a dry cleaner. I told the story of Carl Whitfield's kitchen table, and I told the room, honestly, that whatever mistakes he made in his final year of leadership, his life's true legacy was never really about the firm's balance sheet. It was about proving, 30 years before anyone else in that industry believed it, that Black families deserved the exact same sophistication, discretion, and care that had always been reserved for everyone else's money. I want to tell you about one fellow in particular, because her story is the exact reason I built that program in the first place. Her name is Jasmine Okonkwo, and she came through the very first cohort at 20 years old, a junior at Georgia State working 2 part-time jobs to help her mother cover rent, with absolutely no family connections anywhere near the finance industry, and no idea, in her own words during her first week, what any of these letters after people's names even mean. Jasmine sat through 18 months of paid apprenticeship, shadowing Desmond on the trading desk, sitting in on client meetings with my explicit permission once clients agreed, and slowly building the exact kind of quiet, methodical competence I had once built for myself at her age. She struggled with her Series 65 exam the first time, failed by 4 points, and showed up at my office the next morning before I had even had coffee, asking not for sympathy, but for a study plan. She passed on her second attempt with one of the highest scores anyone at Carter Capital had posted that year. She is 24 now, a full associate portfolio manager with her own growing book of younger clients, several of whom found her specifically because they wanted an advisor who understood firsthand what it felt like to grow up without any generational safety net at all. Watching her walk a 26-year-old nurse through her very first retirement account with the exact same patience and specificity I once used on Carl Whitfield's kitchen table is the closest thing I have to proof that everything that happened with Preston, Bianca, and Sterling was not just a story about revenge. It became the foundation of something that will keep multiplying long after anyone remembers the details of who fired whom in a glass conference room on a random Tuesday morning. Jasmine actually asked me once, during a quiet afternoon a few months into her first year as an associate, why I had chosen to name the entire program after Carl Whitfield instead of after myself, given that I was the one who had built it from nothing. I told her the truth. The program was never really about me. It was about the principle Carl taught me by the simple act of trusting a 23-year-old nobody else at the firm wanted to deal with. The principle that real wealth building in this industry has never been about flashy returns or guaranteed certainty, but about someone willing to sit down, listen carefully, and treat another person's fear about their own future as something worth taking seriously. Carl gave me that lesson for free at his kitchen table over a decade ago. The least I could do was make sure it kept getting passed down to the next 23-year-old who needed it. He left a portion of his remaining estate to the Whitfield Fellowship Program directly, a final gesture I did not learn about until his attorney called me 2 weeks after the funeral. I used the funds to expand the apprenticeship into 2 additional cities within a year, a small, quiet continuation of the exact thing he built his entire career trying to prove was possible. As for Preston, I did eventually hear one more piece of his story, secondhand, through someone who had gone to college with him and ran into him at a gas station outside Marietta. According to that account, he was working steadily, living modestly, no longer chasing the kind of easy inheritance he had spent his entire adult life assuming was permanent. I don't know if that's the whole truth, and it doesn't particularly matter to me anymore whether it is or isn't. I stopped needing his downfall to validate my own success a long time before he finally hit bottom. I think about that Tuesday morning often, not with anger anymore, but with something closer to gratitude, strange as that sounds. Preston handed me, without ever meaning to, the exact proof I needed that competence built quietly over a decade will always outlast arrogance inherited overnight. He thought firing me would prove he was finally in control. What it actually proved was that he had never understood, not even for a single day, whose name was really holding that entire empire together. If this story hit home for you the way I hope it did, tell me in the comments which part surprised you the most: the license, the forged documents, or the ring hitting the marble floor. And if you've ever been the quiet, confident person holding an entire operation together while someone else took the credit, I want you to know something my mother has told me my entire life. Something I finally understood all the way down to my bones the year I built Carter Capital from 3 folding chairs and a single laptop. You do not need permission to be exactly as powerful as you already are. You only need the patience to wait for the moment everyone else finally has to see it too. I think back sometimes to the version of me sitting in that 4th floor parking deck, watching a countdown clock tick toward 30 minutes, genuinely unsure whether I was about to save my career or destroy it completely. There was no guarantee in that moment that any of this would work out the way it eventually did. Federal agencies move slowly and unpredictably. Clients could have panicked and pulled everything regardless of what I told them. The gossip could have stuck permanently instead of unraveling under its own weight. I did not have a crystal ball sitting in that parking deck. I had 11 years of careful preparation, a decision I could stand behind regardless of the outcome, and enough self-respect to refuse letting a 33-year-old with a trust fund and a bruised ego decide what I was worth. That, more than the license, more than the forged documents, more than the ring hitting the marble floor, is the actual lesson underneath all of it. Preparation does not guarantee you win every single fight life puts in front of you, but it guarantees you never have to walk into one of those fights empty-handed. And it guarantees that when someone finally does underestimate you badly enough to test it, you will already know exactly what you are capable of, long before they ever figure it out for themselves. Thank you for watching. Hit subscribe if you want to hear what happens when the next entitled heir underestimates the wrong woman. Because trust me, in this industry, there is always a next one.